Good afternoon. We're back and we're starting the second session. And we'll start by the chair of this session will be Professor Michael van Volt Praag. He's the president of Tibet. Please welcome Dr. Praag.
Thank you very much. I'd very much like to thank both the chairman and the vice chair and the members of the Latvian Parliamentary Support Group for Tibet for hosting this wonderful event, and the Honorable Speaker and Deputy Speaker of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile for inviting me to participate in this very special convention. Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania were, as was mentioned already earlier this morning, and as we all know very well, were occupied by the Soviet Union in 1940. And this was a serious violation of international law, and one that should never have led to any government or any country recognizing the Baltic states as having become a part of the Soviet Union. It took more than half a century for the Baltic states to recover their independence and for the illegal Soviet occupation to end. And during that half century, three important things were critical. One, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, and the Estonians persisted in their opposition to Soviet control. Second, the three occupied countries did not cease to exist as legal states, or did not cease to exist legally as states. Not all countries recognized the annexation of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union, and decades of occupation could not give the Soviet Union sovereignty over the Baltic states because only the freely expressed consent of the people of those states could do that. And third, a sufficient number of governments, parliamentarians, civil society actors stood by the Baltic states during their time of need, even in the face of overwhelming Soviet power. And Tibet's case is strikingly similar. Tibet was illegally invaded and occupied by Communist China a decade after the Baltic states. And we're all aware, obviously, that the Tibetan people suffer and reject Chinese rule. But why has the political support of the international community not persevered? Why is it that today so many people, including government officials, politicians, journalists, and even scholars, refrain from standing up and speaking the truth? Why don't they continue to protest Chinese rule of Tibet? Of course, we all know Beijing immediately punishes by disinviting delegations, by denying access to Tibet, by denying visas, by canceling or postponing contracts. There's various ways in which the Chinese government punishes those that stand up and say the truth. But this type of bullying has not stopped people from fighting other causes, nor did it stop people from fighting for this cause in the past. And I'm not saying that there is not support for Tibet. There obviously is, and you're here to prove that. We also obviously understand the Chinese economic leverage, which is an incredibly important factor. But there's something else going on, and that's what I'd like to draw attention to, because I think it needs our attention and action. Beijing has successfully implemented a well-tested Soviet strategy of reflexive control, or maskirovka, which was originally a strategy developed by the military, and that entails a government's sustained campaign of feeding opponents information that makes them act in ways the government wants them to. The methods vary, and many are premised on the psychological phenomenon that when a brain is exposed to the same information continuously, it begins to perceive that information as true, even if conflicting or contrary evidence is presented. A counterintelligence specialist, Asha Rangappa, explains the strategy in a recent New York Times article 2 weeks ago, and I quote, "The idea is to feed your adversary a set of assumptions that will produce a predictable response. That response, in turn, furthers a goal that advances your interests. By luring your opponent into agreeing with your initial assumptions, you can control the narrative and the ultimate outcome in your favor. Best of all, the outcome is one which your adversary has voluntarily exceeded." Now, over the past 70 years, the PRC has consistently argued and fed its own population as well as the international community the notion that Tibet has always been a part of China, or has been a part of China since ancient times. The result is that whereas the international community widely regarded and condemned China's invasion of Tibet when it occurred, and for several decades after that, as an illegal act of aggression, today many assume, without any conclusive evidence to support that there is some truth to China's claim that Tibet was historically a part of China. We don't know why we agreed to it, but we have this assumption. And this is really highly problematic. By getting us to accept the notion that Tibet may have been a part of China historically, however tentatively we accept that notion, Beijing has us exactly where it wants us, because this assumption alone changes the whole narrative and the very nature of the Tibetan issue. Most importantly, it provides Beijing with plausible legality for its action in Tibet. And as a result, we increasingly see that the conflict, the Sino-Tibetan conflict, is today viewed as an internal affair of China. We don't protest when Tibetans are being labeled as separatists, and we heard an example of that this morning. We inadvertently use the PRC terminology that characterizes Tibetans as, and I quote, "one of the numerous ethnic minority groups of China." And before we know it, we, not the Chinese, have changed and reduced the Tibetan issue to that of a human rights and cultural preservation issue. China still considers it a political issue, but we have changed it. Our governments may see no harm in giving in to Beijing's pressure to make repeated public statements recognizing that Tibet is part of China. Yet those statements not only reinforce the Chinese narrative, but also allow Beijing now to use our government's recognition that Tibet is part of China as a source of legitimacy for their rule in Tibet. And here you have it. It is our governments who are voluntarily legitimizing what the PRC itself cannot legitimize. It's illegal invasion and occupation and annexation of Tibet. And in doing so, we're enabling the PRC to entirely bypass the Tibetan people and their legitimate leaders and their representatives, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration. The PRC no longer sees a need to negotiate. The PRC has us exactly where it wants, and the Maskirovka strategy has worked. Let's be very clear on this issue. The PRC does not claim a right to rule Tibet on the basis of its conquest of Tibet in 1950. It does not claim the right to rule Tibet on the basis of its effective control over Tibet over the past decades. It claims the right to rule Tibet only on the basis of its allegation that Tibet has been a part of China since ancient times, and is now bolstering this sense of legitimacy, this argument for legitimacy, by pointing to our government's recognition of that claim. And this realization brings to the forefront Tibet's history, in that Beijing's claim can no longer be unaddressed. I'm not suggesting that we bring history into the conflict or that we bring history into the negotiations. Beijing already did that by requiring that the Dalai Lama publicly acknowledge that Tibet was a part of China since ancient times as a precondition to substantive negotiations. What I'm saying is that we must challenge China's claim that it is the legitimate sovereign of Tibet today. And since that claim that it is the legitimate sovereign of Tibet is based solely on a false narrative, on a false historical narrative that it has been imposing on all of us, acquiescing to or not challenging China's narrative has very real and serious consequences for the prospects of resolving the Tibetan issue. It has serious consequences for the Tibetan suffering, for our own policy choices of our own governments, and for the security of other states affected by China's use of related or of similar historical narratives to lay claim on foreign territories, as it does, as you well know, in northern India, in the South China Sea, to mention but two of the most obvious examples, but also in regard to dormant territorial disputes involving Mongolia, Japan, Russia, Korea, and Southeast Asian countries. Today I can state with confidence that Tibet was, in fact, historically never a part of China. I'm not saying that Tibet was historically always independent. I'm saying that the study of Mongol, Chinese, Tibetan, and Manchu contemporary historical sources leads to the conclusion that at no time before the PRC's invasion of Tibet was Tibet a part of China. You've been given a working paper that we prepared called Speaking Truth to Power Regarding China's Claim to Tibet. It contains a summary, and if you don't have it, let me know. It contains a summary of the Chinese claim. On the one hand, a summary of the Chinese claim itself, of its right to Tibet. It then unpacks that claim and the accompanying narrative, uncovering why it's not valid, why it does not hold water. It explains why modern concepts of sovereignty and territoriality that China uses cannot be applied to historical Asian polities and to their relations, because it leads to characterizations that are false and therefore conclusions that are false. This paper also similarly explains that we can't apply the norms of the Sinic world, the Chinese legal order, the Sinic world, to historical Inner Asia. And by Inner Asia, I'm talking about especially about the Mongol areas, Mongolia and Tibet. Whereas the PRC and many scholars do use the Sinic legal order to explain the relations with Tibet and relations with Mongolia. We show that to understand the real nature of those relations historically, we must instead apply the principles and the norms of the Jinggisid Mongol legal order and of the Tibetan Buddhist legal order, simply because it is those legal orders that govern those relations. It was within those legal orders that the relations between the Tibetans and the Mongols, the Tibetans and the Manchus, and even to an extent the Tibetans and the Chinese were constructed, regulated, and interpreted. Now, these insights that I just mentioned were gained over a 7 or 8 year period of studying not only Chinese historical sources, but Mongol, Tibetan, and Manchu sources, originally on a quest to understand how such different perceptions of history could grow over time. We engaged with over 70 leading scholars around the world on the issue of the nature of polities in Inner and East Asia in history, the nature of their rule, and the nature of relations between polities in Inner and East Asia. And that resulted in the publication of Sacred Mandates, which is this book. If anybody is interested in that, I have copies to give to you. And this is a book which deals with the nature of international relations in Inner Asia and East Asia from the 13th century to the early 20th century. And it is within this context that we try to understand relations between Tibet and its eastern neighbor, whether it was a Mongolian empire, a Chinese empire, or a Manchu empire, and the Chinese Republic, the Republic of China. With that new understanding that we developed from 8 years of working with all these scholars, we then examined specifically the relationship between Tibet and the Mongol, the Chinese, and the Manchu Empire. To answer the question specifically, was Tibet ever a part of China? And there again, we worked and engaged with some additional 40 scholars to answer that question. And the findings of that study, as well as the international and legal policy consequences of the responses to that question, whether Tibet was ever a part of China, will be presented in a comprehensive Tibet brief, which will be completed in September. So at that time, that will be released. But in the meantime, we have prepared this paper, which you have in front of you, which is a summary of it, as I mentioned earlier, which I encourage you to read because it debunks the narrative of the PRC on its claim that Tibet was always a part of China. People give, and I encourage you to read it also because I think many people feel somewhat uncertain about the question of Tibet, whether Tibet was in fact a part of China in some way or at some time in history. And I think the reason that we do have this insecurity about it is not only because China repeats this mantra constantly, but also because we give the PRC or China the benefit of the doubt when it comes to the history of that part of Asia. We feel insecure because we don't really think we understand the Eastern Asian and Inner Asian history. And so we give China the benefit of the doubt on it. And China takes advantage of that insecurity that we feel. Now, I say all this because there's really important reasons why it really matters whether Tibet was a part of China or not. Stated differently, it really matters that Tibet was not a part of China historically. It's not only an academic question, but one that impacts the situation today. And that is why it's important not to leave this issue unchallenged, not to leave China's claim unchallenged. And let me just explain the principal reasons why this is. It matters because it qualifies the Chinese invasion in 1950 as an act of aggression, as the annexation as illegal, and Tibet's status today as that of an occupied country. Aggression, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a serious violation of international law, and importantly, it cannot lead to lawful acquisition of territory or legal acquisition of sovereignty over another territory. And also recognition by other states, by other governments, of such an illegal annexation is itself a violation of international law. And therefore, a number of our governments are violating international law each time they repeat that Tibet is part of China. That Tibet was not historically a part of China matters because it affects the legal obligations of the PRC under international law. The form of rule implemented in Tibet, the population transfer of Chinese civilians into Tibet, the PRC's cultural and linguistic policies in Tibet, as well as its responses to Tibetan people who resist Chinese rule or complain about it, are subject to legitimate international scrutiny beyond even the domain of human rights, precisely because Tibet is not lawfully a part of China. It matters because it impacts the Tibetans' right to self-determination today, which the PRC opposes with appeals to respect for its territorial integrity. But that territorial integrity cannot apply to Tibet, since Tibet is an occupied territory. Speaking the truth about Tibet's historical status matters because it affects Beijing's perceived need to negotiate. And I think this is particularly important in light of what we've heard this morning about the priorities of the Central Tibetan Administration to bring about a renovation of the dialogue with the PRC. But as long as Beijing senses that the international community buys into Beijing's argument that it has legitimate grounds to rule Tibet, Beijing will not feel pressured either to negotiate with the Tibetan leadership or to change its policies on the ground in Tibet to satisfy the needs of the Tibetans. Whether Tibet was or was not a part of China matters in relation to the negotiations, also because negotiations that start from the premise that Tibet was historically a part of China dramatically shifts the posts of the spectrum of possible outcomes of negotiations, where the middle of that spectrum then is no longer something that can satisfy the Tibetan needs. As you know, the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration have proposed genuine autonomy within the PRC as an acceptable political status to accommodate Beijing's demand that Tibetans abandon independence as an objective in order to resolve the conflict. And genuine autonomy is a compromise somewhere in the middle between a legitimate restoration of independence on the one end of the spectrum and integration and assimilation to China on the other. This is what concretely the middle way approach means. So less than genuine autonomy will not satisfy the needs of the Tibetan people and won't end the conflict between the PRC and Tibet. And if the posts are changed so that the middle way becomes something between genuine autonomy and integration and assimilation, then we're talking about a solution that is far from real autonomy and is very similar to the current situation in Tibet. In other words, we're essentially saying we're satisfied with the way things are. And lastly, that Tibet was not historically part of China matters to all of us because it affects the obligations of all of our states and therefore our own government's policy choices. The status of Tibet, the unlawfulness of the annexation of Tibet, and the right of Tibetans to self-determination have direct consequences for the legal obligations of all states, and in fact for other international actors, including corporations and non-governmental organizations, towards Tibetans, towards the central Tibetan administration, and towards the PRC. We can no longer remain complacent in the face of PRC assertions that the issue of Tibet is an internal affair and one that is out of bounds for other states. In fact, it is an international issue, and the PRC, as well as other states, have the legal obligation to uphold international law and promote the rule of law. With it, they have the obligation to promote the resolution of the conflict. And as part of that, and again I repeat it, they have an obligation not to recognize the illegal annexation. And law requires that they desist from any action that helps the PRC to perpetuate the continuation of its violation of international law, and they have to desist from any activity that helps to consolidate China's position in Tibet. And this brings us to what we must do. I believe we must course correct and actively challenge the PRC's false historical claim. There are many ways to do this, but I'll just mention a couple. We must frame the Sino-Tibetan, and this is, I think, the essence, that we need to frame the Sino-Tibetan conflict as an unresolved international conflict of legitimate international concern. A conflict which is caused by the PRC's illegal annexation of Tibet and that requires urgent attention and urgent resolution. And euphemisms like the issue of Tibet, that I've used in the beginning of this presentation as well, or the Tibetan issue, don't convey the nature of the conflict, nor do they convey the nature of the urgency of it needing to be resolved. As we address symptoms of the conflict, such as human rights violation, cultural deprivation, assimilation, environmental destruction and degradation, lack of access, we must do this in this light and within this framework. And we must hold China to the legal standards that this characterization entails regarding its actions in Tibet. We must also not lose the provenance, the origin of the middle way approach, which was an effort to resolve a conflict caused precisely by the PRC's invasion and continued illegal occupation of Tibet. If we lose sight of this source of the middle way approach in this way, it becomes very difficult to appreciate the generosity of the Tibetan demand for genuine autonomy as a compromise between the two positions that I described earlier. And it's difficult to see genuine autonomy then as a middle way approach. We must therefore actively lobby our governments to cease making statements recognizing Tibet as a part of China. It may seem harmless, since the Dalai Lama and the CTA are today not seeking independence, but autonomy within the PRC, if China agrees to genuine autonomy. But it is not harmless. Such statements validate Beijing's false historical claim, even if they're not intended to. And they undermine the efforts to persuade Beijing to negotiate with Tibetans. Moreover, they pull the rug from under the Tibetan compromise middle way approach. Collectively, these statements effectively shift the middle towards China's positioning, weakening the Tibetans' ability to negotiate while strengthening the Chinese ability to negotiate, which substantively translates into weaker autonomy and greater assimilation. Besides the point I made that this also violates the obligation of states not to recognize the illegal annexation. We must also make clear that Beijing's demand that the Dalai Lama publicly acknowledge that Tibet has been a part of China since antiquity as a precondition to substantive negotiations is simply unacceptable. Members of Parliament are in an excellent position to play a role in all of these things. You can demand of your governments that they at least investigate the basis of the Chinese assertion and carefully consider the consequences and legality of their action before expressing any opinion on the status of Tibet or on the PRC's sovereignty claim. And you can initiate hearings on these issues. You can organize briefings on the subject, draw attention to it, and of course express views in Parliament or parliamentary views of committees or the Parliament as a whole. We must convince governments that receiving representatives of the Central Tibetan Administration, including the Sikyong, including parliamentary leaders who are here present of the Tibetan Parliament in exile, is entirely appropriate and not objectionable under international law or political relations. Because the CTA is the legitimate continuation of the former government of Tibet that was in Lhasa. And despite decades of functioning in exile, this government continues to be the legitimate representative of the Tibetan people. To conclude, one of the CTA's top priorities, as you know, is to get political talks started again with the PRC in order to reach a solution within the keeping of the middle way approach. By taking a clear and truthful stand on the lines that I've suggested, we are supporting the middle way approach. Because my contention is that promotion and conduct of dialogue with China must go hand in hand with a vigorous assertion of Tibetan rights. Only if the rights are forcefully articulated and have resonance and have reached a degree of resonance in the general consciousness as morally and legally just, historically truthful, and politically credible, does a dialogue or negotiations have a real chance. Being strong on the rights and generous on the compromise is the best and the necessary approach. Otherwise, I believe the adjustment of the Tibetan goals and the international community's expectations with respect to those goals will continue to move to accommodate China's unilateral shifting of posts towards its objectives to where there really will be very little left to gain or even to save. So let us start to course correct at this very convention, and let's speak truth to power here and persuade our governments to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Michael van Praag. Now, I invite Dr. Moomin Chen, Vice President of the International Affairs, National Chung Sing University, and Professor at Graduate Institute of International Politics, Taichung, Taiwan. Please.
Okay. The parliamentarians from all over the world, friends of Tibet, I'm very glad to be here today to speak in front of you on this topic. Some of you know that I'm from Taiwan. Yeah, Taiwan is a very small place. Yeah, you don't even see Taiwan on this map. Yeah, too tiny. Yeah, the Tibet is very big. Yeah, okay. But we have been fighting against pressure from China for decades. Yeah, and so we have learned a lot from Tibetan experience, and we also like to share more, and also to learn from each other. Yeah, because we have some common goals. And I'm actually not the expert on Tibet. I'm a scholar of international relations, and I teach more about Chinese foreign policies and China-India relations. But today I would like to give an introduction about how Chinese government, how the ordinary Chinese people see Tibet, more like a historical perspective. I want to make clear that I do not endorse such position, okay? And I do not support, I don't want to defend their position, okay? So if you challenge what I say, yeah, okay, I will not defend, yeah. But I will try to explain to all of you why today, not just the Chinese government, but many ordinary Chinese see Tibet as part of China. Okay. Actually, there are two China. One is Republic China in Taiwan. Our official name is still ROC. And there is another China, PRC, People's Republic of China, in Beijing. Before the 1990s, ROC government, the Taiwan government, considered Tibet is part of China. And today, Taiwan no longer have that position, but the PRC government, they still consider Tibet as part of their territories. And you can see from this slide, there are two maps. The left side is the map claimed by ROC government, and right side is the map of China, PRC. And both maps, you see that the Tibet is considered as their territory. And why so? I'd like to give you some very long history background. Yeah, I will use a few slides. So it won't be a very boring part, don't worry, yeah, because I know some people don't like history. Yeah. So I just, a few slides, give you some general idea. 7th century, in China, it's a Qin Dynasty. And from this map, you can see Tibet is a very big empire. Yeah, when I learned at school, we call it the Tubo Wangchao, Tubo. And later I found out that Tubo means Tibet. So like 1600 years ago, like 1500 years ago, you already had the name Tibet Empire. And early kings like Songtsen Gampo, Chisong Dechen, I think they are around the 7th or 8th century. They make Tibet a very powerful empire, even powerful than China. Yeah, and in year 763, they defeated the Qin Dynasty army and occupied the capital of Chang'an. Yeah. And so at the time that it's no doubt that Tibet is a powerful country. Okay, nobody want to say that the Tibet was part of China then. It is also that around this time Buddhism was first introduced into Tibet. Yeah, but Chinese and Tibet have different interpretations about how Buddhism been introduced. Chinese say it is Princess Wencheng who married Songtsen Gampo, brought Buddhism to Tibet. But Tibetans would say it's a Guru Rinpoche who introduced Buddhism into Tibet. 13th century, it was the Mongols who ruled not just China, but ruled many parts of the Asia. At the time, you could see from the map of the 17th century, not just Tibet, but the whole China were under the rule of the Mongols. And Mongolians, they conquered Tibet in the year 1270. And they maintained control for about 100 years. And Chinese historians today say that Tibet has been under Chinese control, effective control, since this time. But Tibetans or other people will say, come on, at the time, it is not Chinese rule Tibet. It is the Mongolians ruling Tibet and China, okay? So, so who actually ruled Tibet? It's not Chinese, it's Mongolians. Then it's a Qin Dynasty. Qin Dynasty started in mid 17th century and lasted till 1911. What is the relationship between the Qin Dynasty and Tibet? Well, from this map, you see that this is the map of Qin Dynasty, Qin Empire. They also place Tibet, as their territory. What I know, or from Chinese documents, they say that at least from the year 1727, it is Emperor Yongzheng time. They began stationing 2 anbans in Lhasa. And what is anban? Anban is a residential commissioner. Yeah, in Chinese, it's a 驻藏大臣. Yeah. And they say that anbans in Lhasa is actually like a governor. They've been ruling Tibet and reporting to Beijing. Yeah. And in 1792, Emperor Jiaqing issued a 29-article ordinance for the more effective governing of Tibet. The original, document is written not in Chinese, in Tibet. And this document, from Chinese perspective, they think that it tells us very detailed about Tibet should be ruled, okay? Including, they even include how Dalai Lama is selected. It means that China has some authority over many things on Tibet, including selection of Dalai Lama. At the end of the 19th century, Qing Empire, they initiated a series of reforms to consolidate the rule in Tibet. Before that, I think that most of this, I would say, their claim was just symbolic. But after the British, they conquered